Welcome to KHS525, the Planning and Managing Sport Facilities course. This is the Week 1 voiceover PowerPoint. We'll first start with Chapter 1, which is the Introduction to Planning and Managing Sport Facilities. This chapter gives a quick overview of what the career entails, what main topics are discussed in the book, and what types of things that we'll be looking at in terms of operational planning. Let's begin talking about what the purpose of this course is. Obviously, it's an introduction to sport facility and event management, but we'll also be learning about the benefits and the opportunities within the facility and event management industry. And we'll also start to understand what issues in event and facility management that managers face. Now, many of you may not be considering a career in facility or event management, but hopefully once you've taken the class, you'll start to see the benefits and the opportunities in the industry. Even if you never work in facility operations, it's really imperative that you understand the issues and the concerns that managers and events face on a daily basis. Now, through the full 7 weeks of this course, we have to keep in mind that there are lots and lots of different types of facilities. Everything from arenas such as the NBA, stadiums when it comes to the NFL, there's racetracks, ski areas, golf courses, swimming pools, football fields at the high school level. There's BMX tracks, snowboarding, curling, you name it. Now, with all those facilities, the potential risks for people going in and out of that facility greatly increases. It can be everything from a slip and fall to defective equipment, perhaps poor supervision by the staff, whether they're inadequately trained or just not paying attention. There could be inadequate insurance at the facility and maybe poor planning. And it can even be the participants or the spectators within that facility that are disruptive, whether they're intoxicated, they don't know the rules, or in some cases, maybe hooliganism or violence in the crowd. Now, when it comes to sport facilities, they're not new concepts. They've been around for a long, long time. They've been in existence since the Roman era. Think about the Roman Colosseum or Circus Maximus. Now, but even though sport facilities and managing these events have been around for centuries, the components of curriculums or those educational programs that you are enrolled in, and this includes the event management, the marketing, the risk management, those have only been around for about 50 years. The first university-wide sport management program was established in 1966 at Ohio University. Not the Ohio State University, but Ohio University. Now, anyone with an interest in pursuing a career in the event or facility management industry has to understand the connection between the events themselves, the facility that the events occur in, and all the risks that come along with hosting that event. But even though the sport and entertainment facility industry has been around for quite a long time and has pretty substantial growth over the past few years, the amount of information that's out there, the amount of information that's published about how to do event management or research about event management is far from extensive. Now, in Chapter 1, the book talks about topics for further investigation. And what these are 4 main topics that are to be considered as we discuss events and facility management through the session. The first issue that the book deals with is the idea of green facilities or environmentally friendly facilities. And many people call this sustainable facility management. So what is sustainability? Well, the book definition from your textbook, sustainability is defined as a dynamic philosophy where an organization recognizes its social responsibility pertaining to environmental matters. Now, certainly there are the social responsibility components of being a green facility and doing what's right for the environment. But also keep in mind that facilities and events are also businesses. So a secondary motivation would be aimed at reducing energy expenditures. The less money that they have to spend at, the more money that they'll make in the end. Now, there is a huge environmental impact of modern facilities these days. Think about how large new facilities have gotten, how much parking is involved, how much ancillary development in and around the stadiums have become. That takes a huge hit on the environment in and around the stadium. But the question is then, how does sustainable facilities affect an organization's or facility's bottom line? Ultimately, what it comes down to is that by installing environmentally friendly lighting, using recyclable materials, reducing the carbon footprint, ultimately what those initiatives do is reduce the costs overall in the long term for the facilities, and then the organization will make more money. There are many different strategies that facilities use and lots of different new and innovative green technologies to help facilities become more sustainable. There's many that are very common, such as high efficiency lighting. In some cases, you see special parking spots for fuel efficient automobiles, like electric cars where they can plug in. There's low flow plumbing fixtures. There's many facilities and stadiums that use solar panels or wind power, and also using recycled construction materials. In many new facilities, they're using rainwater retention technology, where rain will fall and perhaps it'll go into a collection basin underneath the field, and then that water would be used for irrigation or maybe plumbing. There's also underground trash sorting treatment facilities. In some newer stadiums and facilities, when you throw something away in a trash can, there's actually no bag, and it will go down through a tube to a central location where things can be collected and recycled in various different ways. There's obviously paper and magazine recycling containers and facilities. Many new stadiums and new facilities are using organic composting materials where everything that they sell is compostable, and also selling beverages in refillable bottles, sort of like the Swell bottle or the Nalgene bottle that we're all used to. The next topic that the book talks about for further investigation is the idea of violence in sport and entertainment. Now, the violence in sport and the threat risk has certainly changed since September 11th, 2001, and it's a whole new world when it comes to facility and event management. There's lots of new, or what we would consider new over the past 15 years, safety initiatives for spectators. These would be metal detectors. Very often there are no-fly zones over stadiums, especially at large events, say like the Super Bowl or the World Cup. There's permanent barricades or the cement blocks that go in front of entranceways. There's many more pat-down searches in addition to metal detectors. And also, especially in mega events, there's a lot of training now that occurs with security personnel to recognize and deal with biological explosions or some sort of weapon of mass destruction. There are certain high-profile events that are usually on the world stage and draw a lot of attention when it comes to protecting against terrorism and violence. The Olympics, the FIFA World Cup, the Super Bowl, many of these large worldwide mega events are attractive terrorist targets. Now, the sources say that if there is a true stadium attack, it could result in about 10 to 15 times the number of deaths as September 11th, which is an incredible amount. So the question is, are there fail-safe solutions possible for you as a manager of an event or facility? And ultimately, the answer is no. You can be as safe as possible and you can plan as much as possible, but you can never be 100% sure that there won't be any risk. Certainly, there are a number of different types of violence that could occur. There are the terrorist attacks, there might be a bomb detonation, but again, those are few and far between. Often we fail to think about some of the more common issues that facility managers would deal with. Maybe like fans entering the playing surface, or a fan jumping on a court to confront an athlete, or maybe a streaker. Now, when dealing with any type of violence or interaction with an unruly fan, it's important to be preventative and reactive. Now, there's no doubt that incidents will occur. We can't prevent everything. But we also have to think about having preventative procedures and not only having reactive measures. So we need to plan for and prevent certain events from happening rather than simply planning on how we would take care of it if it does happen. And those decisions made by the management and staff save lives, they really do. And they also mitigate or lessen the damage that might be caused to a facility. The third topic that the book talks about for further investigation is innovative and creative stadium designs and new events. And this is something that we've all seen. There's been more than 75 completely new arenas or stadiums around the world between 2007 and 2016. And that's quite a lot and quite a bit amount of money. Now, these new stadium technologies and these radical designs and really innovative technology also comes with a unique image and sometimes a really crazy design for how the facility is actually structured. Now take a couple minutes and watch a video. Click on the Modern Training Grounds link on this slide and it will bring you to a YouTube video that talks about the top 5 most innovative training grounds in soccer around the world. And when you're done with that, come back and continue the PowerPoint. The fourth topic of investigation in Chapter 1 talks about the globalization of sport. Now, obviously, sport is a global pastime. Construction and renovation has gone on around the world. As the YouTube video noted, it's been estimated that in the US alone, $22 billion was invested in a short 5-year period between 2005 and 2010. And a lot of that construction and renovation is intended to draw an international audience. Now, there's an international phenomenon in sport. When it comes to North American sports being spread overseas, we have NHL games in London. We have NFL regular season games in London. But there's also a number of international franchises and teams that travel to North America to play in tournaments and exhibition matches. So in conclusion, in Chapter 1, yes, sport events are very highly publicized. They produce a lot of revenue. They can bring a lot of attention across the world to one particular spot. But they can be potentially dangerous. There is a lot of risk that's involved with hosting these events. And that's why managers have to understand the best practices in running, developing, and managing these facilities and events. And an important component of that is thinking about the risks and the liability involved with running a facility and hosting events. This is going to be a common theme that we talk about and discuss over the course of the session. And it's very important that as managers, you understand the history of what's involved with facility management and event management, but also what are the current practices that those facility managers are working with. Let's move on to Chapter 2 and talk about sport event operations. In this chapter, we'll talk about how sport event management and sport facility management intersect and how to manage and best plan moving forward. So what is sport management? Your book defines sport management as the coordination of all the tasks and activities necessary for the execution of an event regarding its strategy, planning, implementation, and control based on the principles of event marketing and the methods of project management. So when faced with planning and producing an event, figuring out what it is you've been hired to do or what an organization is putting on, that's the necessary first step. And successful event management involves many different elements. Now, before developing any specific functional plans or functional area plans, an event manager has to be really very familiar with the facility and the organization's philosophy and mission. Now, these will help guide the selection, the type of marketing, and the type of management that occurs within the event. Now, from the starting point after you understand the philosophy and mission, you have to address certain things. You have to address the recruiting and training of professional event management staff and volunteers. You need to understand how to develop good relations with different community partners and different corporate partners that may be investing money in your organization. You also have to understand how to conduct an event risk management plan or a risk assessment and develop that plan accordingly. And then finally, you obviously need to implement some sort of adequate or well-running guest management system where you can take care of the spectators and events that are attending. Through the event planning process and producing that event, the event and facility managers has to continually ask themselves a number of questions. Has the facility or event team conducted a SWOT analysis where they look at the strengths, weaknesses, opportunities, and threats of their organization, or maybe it's past events or part of the upcoming event? They have to think about what the facility's primary objective is. Why is that organization hosting that event? Is it simply for money? Is it to promote goodwill? The objectives need to be thoroughly questioned. What are the necessary steps to make sure that there's proper crowd management? How are we going to keep people safe? And then finally, in terms of customer satisfaction, we need to understand or ask ourselves what policies, programs, or maybe procedures are we going to develop to make sure there is a high level of customer satisfaction for not only the athletes, but the spectators, the sponsors, or any stakeholder within the organization. Now, in terms of the intersection between sport event management and facility management, we have to ask ourselves, what impact does the specific facility have on the event that's being run? In the context of a sport facility, event management is a social and a technical process that uses the facility's resources, but also influences how the people behave within that event or facility. And that might be the staff, the volunteers, spectators, or athletes. And we have to look at how that social and technical processes produce an event that hopefully is consistent with the facility and event's philosophy, mission, and goals. Now, keeping all that in mind, planning and producing that event or making that event happen, it's a very complex product. It's full of unseen circumstances. Again, you never know what's going to happen. You should be planning for any number of events to happen, but you're also constrained by the facility's limitation. A very easy example of that is you are constrained by the number of seats that are within a stadium or arena, and that helps define how you will plan for a specific event. Now, the book talks about something called the event triangle and festival frames. Here we'll talk about the event triangle. Now, at the most basic, the textbook argues that a sport, recreation, or any sort of entertainment event can be looked at as the shape of a triangle. Now, each side of that triangle represents an important stakeholder in the event, or the party that might have a stake in the event's success. And those are the people that have to be satisfied if the event is going to be successful. On the one side, you have participants, another side, you have sponsors, and on the third side, you have spectators. Now, Powder, your job as an event manager is to do three things. First, accurately identify all the needs, wants, and desires that were expressed by those stakeholders. You need to understand what they're looking for. You have to recognize if any one of those stakeholders or one of those sides of the triangle and what they want conflict with one another. So do the sponsors' wants and needs conflict with participants or spectators? And lastly, if there are any conflicts, you as a manager have to negotiate those areas at least as much as you can to make sure that you do satisfy, in the best of your ability, the needs, wants, and desires of each one of those stakeholders. Now, as the book talks about, looking at the event festival frame is a way that we as managers can sort of provide a framework on how we can plan for a sporting event within a much larger context, within the venue itself, and also the relevant surrounding areas. Now, the way of looking at a festival frame, that includes the parking lots that are outside the stadium's entrances. It might include the entrances into a stadium, perhaps the concourses, or maybe the large gathering groups, or where vendors or concession stands are located. But the festival frame can also include the neighborhoods that surround the stadium. It might include the restaurants, the hotels, the shopping, the bars. Think of example of Wrigleyville in Chicago, where Wrigley Field and the Chicago Cubs are located. Wrigleyville is part of the festival and has grown because of where the stadium is. Now, breaking it down a little bit further, we can move from the festival frame to the spectacle frame. And that's where the actual sport occurs or takes place on the field, and also where the majority of the spectators or fans are viewing the actual contest on the field. It also might include the tunnels or walkways where fans enter the field. But again, with modern facilities and newer stadiums and arenas, the division between the festival frame and the spectacle frame is becoming blurred. So there's a lot of stadiums now that allow fans to view the sport from different locations like bars or party decks or standing only seating or standing only tickets at the concession stands. Now, regardless of if the festival and spectator frames are blurred, it truly is still a fact that the majority of the spectacle frame, or where people are viewing the sport, consists of general ticket buyers, reserve seating, clubs or box seatings, and maybe we can consider luxury suites. But still, that spectacle frame or spectator area is usually separated from the court, whether it's by a wall, whether it's by concrete, steel, or maybe even cement. A third frame or area of the event is the behind the scene frame. And this exists through both the festival and spectator frames, but it consists of all those things that are sort of backstage, things that are out of view. And these things include, loading docks, the locker rooms, could be the security centers, or maybe the emergency medical stations. It can include the electrical and heating rooms. These are really invisible, or at the least very well hidden from the spectators, and it's not meant to be part of the spectator experience. However, sometimes the infrastructure that actually shows up in an event sometimes can be visible to those individuals who are not supposed to see it. Now, having discussed those three different viewpoints, the next step is to outline a process for planning, organizing, and managing the event. And during this process, the manager collects a ton of relevant data that's going to be used later on. They adapt plans when, potentially a good idea comes about, or maybe there's a security tip, and ultimately optimizing all of the strategies that they can use in managing that event. Now, after you've planned your event and completed it, it's important to determine whether it's achieved its goals. Now, because of that, you have to have measurable objectives. Strategies and tactics need to be identified. Information needs to be collected well before the event actually starts. The goals and objectives can be tracked throughout the event, throughout the whole occurrence of the event, and be connected back to what was originally planned. However, through this planning process, again, you have to recognize the constraints of the facility or the resources that the event staff have. The planning process involves three phases. It's the event planning model. It includes the strategic phase, the conceptual phase, and the operational phase. In the first phase, the strategic planning component, managers need to determine and define how big the event's going to be, the size and the scope of the event that's going to occur within the facility. And again, managers constantly ask questions of themselves, and some of these questions should be asked not only of the manager, but also the event management team, which typically consists of the leaders or directors or staffers who are responsible over the event execution. There's a number of different questions that are asked. Some simple ones are, is the event that's being planned private or public? Because that can have a big impact on how you develop the event management plan. What type of people will the event attract? What type of spectators or participants will that event attract? And again, a big question is, what are the financial considerations? What has to be evaluated when planning the initial idea of the event? What are the goals? How much profit is being made? Where will charitable donations go? A number of questions managers need to continually ask themselves in the strategic phase. Now, as managers and the event management team ask these questions, it's important to consider the organization's strengths, weaknesses, and whether they can be identified. Now, many types of organizations call this the SWOT analysis, and it's extremely important to conduct one in the event planning. Initially, identifying the strengths, weaknesses, and opportunities involves the organizational internal strengths and weaknesses, and also the external opportunities and threats. So, for example, do the members of the event management team have experience in planning and producing an event that's being currently planned? If they do have experience, will it be a strength? Probably. However, if there isn't anybody in the organization that's ever organized or produced an event that's similar to it, it could be considered inexperience and probably be determined that it's a weakness. And regardless, whatever the results of the SWOT analysis are, it's important that the event planning staff moves on to the next steps based on those results. And that's generating different courses of action based on the SWOT analysis. The plans have to be actionable, mean they actually have to be able to be completed. They have to be able to be measurable, meaning that at the end of the planning or at the end of your strategies, you can measure to determine if you did them correctly. And then it's ultimately up to the managers to be able to evaluate the success of the plan. Now, as the individual functional areas, maybe it's the volunteer committee or the marketing committee, as they develop their plans, it's important that checklists be created that outline what the specific tasks are and when they have to be accomplished. And this is incredibly important if the personnel or the employees change, where the checklists that are developed can be offloaded onto new team members. So take, for example, if there's a hospitality committee and the team loses their manager for illness. The rest of the team has to have some sort of quick reference guide to see what's completed. So they can take this checklist and keep on going with the plan. It also creates a measure of accountability for team members. If there's a checklist, people will understand what everybody's job responsibilities are to be. The next stage in the planning process is the conceptual planning. And much of the conceptual plan revolves around the proper management of volunteers, event, staff, and those spectators or stakeholders that might be involved in producing the event. In order to achieve, a really memorable experience for fans, the event managers have to get the basic elements of event staffing correctly. Event staff planning is really just one part of the overall event staffing process. But it's important to remember that staffing, other than constructing the actual stadium, is probably the most difficult aspect of producing and pulling off any major sporting event. Now, just like determining the objective of the overall event, the manager has to determine the staff's responsibilities within that event. What are you and your staff's duties not only during the event, but also before and after? And determining those duties or those responsibilities will help you develop and plan in each one of the functional areas. Could be the operation titles, or maybe the organizational structure within those areas. Now, once you've determined the needs and the job descriptions of those individuals, that's when you begin recruiting and training individuals. Now, recruiting the right staff members involves finding individuals with BFOQ, and that stands for bona fide occupational qualifications. Essentially, that means recruiting and training the people who have the knowledge, the right skills, and the right attitudes that you want to fulfill your staffing. Now, as anybody who's ever been part of some sort of athletic event knows, coaches and players always meet before a game, before the contest. Players might meet with their individual position coaches, players might meet amongst themselves, then usually the entire team meets just before the game or that match begins. So why do teams meet just before the athletic events? Well, if the team or athlete isn't prepared by that point in time, isn't just before the game too late? Well, extending that analogy, the final planning meeting or briefing just before an event should be a standard operating procedure for any event manager. More than anything, a pre-event meeting or briefing allows everybody on the event management team to make sure that all of those checklists have been completed, have been updated, have been reviewed, and make sure that all the logistics, the planning, the delivery has been coordinated. And it also makes sure that the planning or the checklists are all on schedule. By doing all that, it increases the likelihood that any last minute mistakes or things that might have been overlooked could be found out, corrected, and planned for. Now, having continual and ongoing briefings and meetings pre-event are the opportunities where an event management uh, or manager can really establish a culture of professionalism within that event management organization. From the moment that those upper level or top event managers hold the very first event brainstorming meetings at the very beginning to the very end of planning in the individual function areas. By doing these team briefings or pre-event meetings, it helps build upon the last and develop this culture of professionalism. One of the biggest mistakes during event planning is losing track of the event as it's actually occurring or as it's actually happening in real time. We can develop all the checklists that we want, and they're very linear in the fact that we check one thing off and we move to the next. And most employees, managers, and staff usually work from the top down when it comes to these lists. But in actuality, as we all know, the events don't always happen or unfold in that fashion going from the top down. And that requires adaptability and also the skill of improvisation or making things up as you go. And this is a very important skill for event and facility managers to have. Now, just because something unexpected happens or the plans don't exactly um, occur as you think they were, the plans and the checklist shouldn't be like given up. You don't abandon them. If the event's planning is solid, there's a pretty good chance that the event itself will likely take place according to plan. If nothing goes according to plan, then it's probably a sign that the planning wasn't done in a very um, well thought out manner from the get-go. And this is important to keep in mind during the post-event evaluations or when you're going back to evaluate how the planning was conducted. Now, when it's possible, it's always a good idea to set a benchmark within the event. So this would allow staff or managers to sort of check off the event status. And it's critical for the supervisors or managers to periodically communicate with the managers. This allows for ongoing assessment and making sure those in-event checklists actually are occurring successfully. Now, by doing all this, it will help, ensure that the important items aren't forgotten in the planning process. It's really important that everything is written down or documented in one form or another, because if nothing gets written down, if nothing gets documented, it's bound to be forgotten. Now, even though it takes a lot of effort and a lot of time to track things as they're occurring, it makes the evaluation of the event after it's all complete much more meaningful and much easier to complete. There's a number of other additional event planning suggestions and event production suggestions that book talks about. And also regular managers of events will also talk about these same skills. One of those is looking at it from a reverse perspective, and that's planning in reverse after your event's completed. Look at cleanup, the evaluations post-event, and then work backwards through the event to the first planning session. Managers are really less likely to forget things when they're forced to look at things from this reverse perspective. Some other additional suggestions for monitoring development and the event planning process is, again, we've talked about it, develop event checklists to reflect the event's budget. Don't plan things that the budget can't support. Don't plan things that you don't have enough money to pay for, very specifically. Also recognize the influence of Murphy's Law. Now, if people don't know what Murphy's Law is essentially anything that can go wrong will go wrong. So if you recognize Murphy's Law and plan for anything going wrong, you can develop better checklists. You can plan for unusual or crazy occurrences. You can build some of that flexibility or improvisation into the event checklist. And finally, use brain chain thinking. And that's where you develop alternative outcomes based on changes in the external environment. So it's the process of asking, what if? What if scenario A occurs? What if scenario B occurs? What will be our response? That brings us to the end of the lecture material. On the next couple slides, I'll talk about things that you need to pay attention for the next few weeks. Looking ahead for what's coming up, we are in week 1 right now. You have obviously watched this PowerPoint. Hopefully you have read chapters 1 and 2 in the textbook, and you have 2 discussion boards that you're responsible for answering by Thursday at 7 p.m. The first discussion board is a video post, but you do not need to provide any references or citations for that, and also peer responses are not required for that first question. However, keep in mind the second discussion board does require peer responses and citations, and peer responses are due by Sunday at 7 p.m. For week 2, you'll be watching the week 2 PowerPoint. You'll be going over chapters 3 and 4 from the textbook. There will be 2 discussion board questions. One of those is a video post. And at the end of week 2, the first assignment, the stadium funding PowerPoint, will be due. And on the next slide, I'm going to go over some of the details with that assignment. For the stadium funding PowerPoint, you're going to be using the readings, any research that you do outside of this class, the textbook, and things that I've talked about in the voiceover PowerPoints. To compile a list of both pros and cons, or advantages and disadvantages, for the arguments for a local taxpayer group to provide investments in a new sport facility. So essentially, you're going to be developing lists for the pros and cons for having the local community members use tax dollars or other public resources to help construct a new facility or maybe a renovated facility. After you present those pros and cons, you're going to share your own personal opinion on whether public resources or public subsidies for those sport facilities are good or bad. What's your opinion about it? And also providing a rationale behind your opinion. So not just giving your opinion, explain why you have that opinion. The PowerPoint should be a minimum of 10 slides, maximum of 20 slides. The rubric is available on Blackboard. So remember, this is a voiceover PowerPoint. No less than 10 slides, no more than 20, and it's about your opinion and the pros and cons of the public providing resources to build new facilities or to fund renovated facilities. That officially brings us to the end of the week 1 PowerPoint. Thank you all for listening, for paying attention. And again, if you have any questions or comments, please don't hesitate to reach out and contact me.